I want to say from the start that my work is in cognitive neuroscience, but very influenced by many of the disciplines that are represented there. And my first fundamental point is that this brain, if you will, is going to be transformed by many aspects of culture, but especially reading and language, and how that is affected will affect the development of the next generation. I want to actually begin, thanks to both Marcelos, but particularly Marcelo Sanchez Rondo, with the philosopher Nicholas of Cusa, who asked, what do we do when we are confronted, as we are in discussions of AI, with the coincidence of opposite believable truths? And Nicholas Cusa actually offered us a wonderful, if you will, metaphor for a process of us taking a stance of learned ignorance, but to look and examine both of these with great care and precision, which is what the whole meeting is about. I turned to my colleague, Sherry Turkle, who said something that actually could well go under Sarah's seventh commandment, which is not to disrupt the true potentials of others. But what Turkle and I both believe is that the transgression that we have in AI and all of the next innovations is that we do not ask in time what any of these will disrupt or in fact impede the development. And so what I'm using as a case study is what we know about the influence of digital exposure on two of our most important human aspects. And not unlike James Williams, one of these aspects is language. And I use the extraordinary work by Toni Morrison to talk about language as generative. She said, we die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. We do, I put a special emphasis on do language. That may be the measure of life. And so what I'm really most interested is in how language, and this goes back to Walter Ong as well, how language is shaped, how language is impeded or changed inside the digital dilemma that AI represents an example par excellence of. So my colleague Naomi Barron says this: the real question is where the affordances of reading, remember that's my case study, the affordance of reading on digital screens and of AI will lead us to a new normal, a different way. Now think on a different form of consciousness when we read, which is how we absorb information in our world, one in which length, conceptual complexity, memory especially, and attention and reflection are potentially lost. Now, with my colleague Stanislas Dehaene, who's in the Academy of Science, he and I are interested in using the circuit of oral language and written language to understand what will be lost or impeded. So if you just look at this quick depiction of the reading brain, you will see how it's actually, it itself never existed in the beginning. The human brain was never born to read. That's the first line of my book, Proust of the Squid. Rather, the reading represents, and this is important for all the new cognitive inventions that we as a species will make, the brain is designed to be able to make new connections and new circuits. But the catch, the Achilles heel and the Achilles strength, is that this rearrangement of these genetically endowed parts will be affected by the environment, by the writing system. You'll have different reading brains for Chinese and English, but it will also be affected by the medium. This is what so many people fail to understand, but Walter Ong, I think, presciently anticipated. And he said something that I think is so important for us to remember. Technologies are not mere external aids. I really feel very strongly that we can't just talk about them as tools, but rather they make interior transformations of consciousness, never more than when they affect the word. And this is certainly the case in what I call the deep reading processes that begin with the analogical skills, but they include not just inference and analogy, but also what Father John Donne talked about as the what we would call the compassionate and cognitive aspects of empathy, in which reading allows us to pass over into the lives and feelings of others. This is the birthplace of the moral imagination that our last speakers are really talking about. In addition, both critical analysis and contemplation are the fruits of this ability to read more and more deeply, which is being threatened by the skimming nature of how we read on digital technologies. And so, what critical analysis is doing is helping us bring together all these different forms of cognition for the evaluation of truth, the evaluation of what in fact AI's input could be. So this is a really important part of the development of language, oral and written, in our next generation. Very important, simple insight. Each medium is going to be reflected in that brain circuit, and the digital screen reading is impacting what I am calling these deep reading processes, from inference and empathy to critical thinking and the contemplative function. In addition, one of the aspects of language is also how we write. And here I use Shakespeare to really talk about two things. One is that the effort that we, with our rapacious appetite for efficiency, are losing, we are losing the very efforts that help develop the circuits for oral language, written language, and writing. Reading and writing are thinking, and they are inextricably bound. And so when we talk about the skimming of reading, we're also talking about what is happening with when our efforts to write are being outsourced, and those very efforts in development are short circuiting not just the circuit for writing, but the circuit for thought. Now, I'm going to give only two pieces of research just because of time, but quickly enough, even digital exposure at year one has implications for attention and language. At the same time, this, if you look even further ahead, what happens in early childhood is going to affect the 8-year-old, is going to affect the 16-year-old in their brain circuitry, leading me to worry very much whether we are headed towards what I call the cerebral Wall-E effect, where we become so accustomed to over-reliance and offloading that those efforts for the circuit lead us, like this animated film many of you might have seen, to the obese creature unable any longer to control what actually the computers, if you remember in that film, are doing. In other words, our ability to form effortful and use effortful processes that build those circuits could be threatened by an unthoughtful use of AI. I am working with my colleagues right now on what would be the useful aspects, especially with the differentiation with disabilities. But finally, I just simply want to say the implications, as all of us know in this meeting, go well beyond the cognitive linguistic processes. They lead to how we evaluate truth, how we in fact are able or unable to evaluate false information, which leads us to a threat for democracy, which I know some of you have already mentioned. Finally, I will say that my hope is that we are moving in the direction of the preservation of language as we most know its relationship to thought, and a very thoughtful use of AI for those aspects will increase our humanity. Just as Pope Francis said 5 years ago, where the danger is also grows the saving power. That's the genius in the human story. There's always a way to escape destruction. Where humankind has to act is precisely there in the threat itself. That is where the door opens. I believe human development of language, reading, writing give us a case study on how to think about where the threat is and how we can become more digitally, if you will, biliterate in a very humane way. Thank you so much.